My name is Gilles Parenteau. I am 74 years old. I worked for 31 years as a forestry surveyor with the BC Ministry of Forests, and I retired in 1993, and I have not spoken publicly about what happened in September of 1969 in the upper Blaeberry River drainage above the town of Golden, British Columbia, until this morning. The recorder is a small thing that belongs to my grandson, and he has left it on the kitchen table and asked me to speak into it before I lose my nerve, and so I am speaking into it, in my kitchen, with the window showing me the same kind of sky it showed me that week in 1969, which is a grey sky with the weight of early autumn in it, the kind of sky that does not threaten snow yet, but is remembering the possibility. Hector Deschênes died on the 3rd of February 2003 at the age of 81 in the Jubilee Hospital in Victoria. He had been the foreman of the survey crew that went into the Blaeberry drainage on the 14th of September 1969. 7 men in total, and he was one of 2 men who walked out on the 22nd. He was the one who said nothing to the inquiry. I was the other one, and I said very little. And what I said was true, as far as it went, which was not very far. Hector made me promise, on the walk out, that I would not speak until he spoke first, and he never spoke first. And now he is gone, and that promise ended with him, and I intend to honor what I believe he would want me to do, which is to make certain that someone, somewhere, understands what happened in those 8 days before we disappear entirely into the official record and are remembered only as the crew whose 5 men were never found. I want to be careful here. I want to be exact. I spent 31 years measuring things, marking things, recording distances and elevations, and the precise coordinates of stands of timber, and I understand the weight of a number, and the discipline of stating only what can be verified by the person who was present when the measurement was taken. What I am going to describe happened to me. I observed it. I cannot tell you what it means. I do not know what it means. I have thought about what it means for 34 years, and I have arrived at nothing that would satisfy an inquiry, or a scientific report, or a man from a government office. And I have stopped trying to arrive at any such thing. And what I am offering instead is the precise account of what I saw and heard and understood, in the order in which I saw and heard and understood it. And I will tell you clearly when I am speculating and when I am reporting. And I will tell you clearly what I do not know, because the things I do not know are a large and important part of this account. The survey crew in the fall of 1969 was 7 men. Hector Deschênes, the foreman, was 47 years old and had worked in the BC interior forests for 22 years. He was from Rouyn-Noranda originally and had the build and the manner of a man who had been doing physical work since before he was old enough to choose it, wide through the shoulders, quiet in speech, decisive in action, and possessed of a quality that I have tried to name for 34 years and have never quite managed, which was a kind of accurate patience, the patience of someone who has understood that the forest will not be hurried and has made his peace with that entirely. Patrice Auger was 24 years old, from Kamloops, just 2 years into his forestry work, still in the habit of narrating his own experience aloud, as if to make it more real. He was the youngest on the crew and the most eager, and he talked about the mountains, the way young men talk about things they have newly fallen in love with, which is to say, he talked about them constantly and with insufficient precision. Serge Villeneuve was 31, from Quebec City, by way of Prince George, a compact and methodical man who kept a small notebook in his shirt pocket and wrote down the lunch hour, temperature every day as a matter of personal discipline. André Paquette was 29, and he was the one who cooked for the crew when we were in the field. And he had an extraordinary memory for the weights of things, for the specific caloric calculations of a day's labor at elevation. And he took the feeding of 7 men in remote terrain as seriously as a general takes the feeding of an army. Clement Moreau was 44, the second most experienced man on the crew after Hector, a former timber cruiser who had transitioned to reforestation survey work after an injury to his left knee that made sustained uphill work difficult. He had a slow and comprehensive way of looking at a landscape that I have always associated with men who have spent so many years looking at particular things in a particular kind of light that they have learned to see what others miss by habit. And Yves Thibodeau was 26, a quiet man from Lac-Saint-Jean who had come west 2 years before, and who seemed to find the Rocky Mountain landscape unsettling in a way he could, not articulate, who looked at the peaks with a kind of alertness that was not quite fear, but was also not comfort, and who was, of the 6 men I went into the forest with, the one whose face I see most clearly when I try to remember them. I need to tell you what the Blaeberry drainage is, because the geography matters. The Blaeberry River drains eastward from the Columbia icefield into the Columbia River at Golden, and the upper drainage, above the point where we were surveying, is a country of dense Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir that runs up to timberline at approximately 1,800 meters. And above that is rock and ice and a sky that seems, at that elevation, to belong to a different version of the world than the one you left at the trailhead. The creek bottoms are choked with alder and willow, and the kind of brush that grabs at your legs and slows your progress in a way that is humbling if you are in a hurry, and simply the nature of the place if you are not. We had been contracted to survey a section of the upper drainage for reforestation potential following a fire that had come through the area in 1965. And the work involved establishing sample plots at regular intervals across the burn scar, measuring seedling density, recording slope aspect, and estimating soil conditions. It was methodical, physical work, the kind of work I had done dozens of times in a dozen different watersheds. And there was nothing unusual about the assignment, except the particular quality of the country, which was remote even by the standards of remote places, and which had, even in good weather, a feeling of depth to it, a sense that the space between the trees contained more than the distance your eye could measure. We drove in from Golden on the morning of September 14th, on a logging road that had not been maintained since the fire, and we cached the vehicles at the end of the passable section, and carried our gear approximately 7 kilometers into the drainage to the survey camp, which was a pair of canvas wall tents and a cook tent that had been staged there by the ministry the previous week. The weather was clear and cold in the mornings, warming to perhaps 12 degrees Celsius by midday, with a wind off the ice above the tree line that came down the drainage edge in the afternoons and made the aspens in the burn scar sound like they were, whispering to each other in a language that was almost but not quite comprehensible. We spent the first full day, September 15th, establishing our base grid and confirming our sample plot coordinates against the aerial photographs we had been given, and Hector and I walked the perimeter of the survey area while the others set up the cook tent and sorted equipment. And it was on that walk, in the late afternoon of the 15th, that Hector stopped on the edge of a small clearing and stood still for what I estimated to be nearly 3 minutes without saying anything, looking at the far tree line. I waited. I had worked with Hector long enough to know that when he went still like that, in the way a man goes still, when something has registered that the conscious mind has not yet translated into language, the correct response was to wait. He said, finally, that we should not go past the creek junction on the high route. I asked him why. He said he did not know why. He said it the way a man states a professional judgment he cannot fully explain, but will not revise. And I noted it, and I believed him, and I intended to follow that instruction. And so did he. And what happened is that the weather came in 2 days later and separated us from the valley crew in a way that made his instruction impossible to follow. The 16th was our first full day of sample plot work, and we split into 2 groups as planned, Hector and I taking the high ridge route to cover the upper sample plots, while Villeneuve, Paquette, Moreau, Thibodeau, and Auger took the valley floor route to cover the lower section, with a plan to meet at the survey camp at the end of the day. The high route gave us 7 completed sample plots by 4 in the afternoon, and Hector and I were back at the camp before the valley crew, which was not unusual. The valley floor route was slower because of the brush and the creek crossings, and we had a hot meal ready. When they came in at 6:30, all of them wet to the knee and arguing cheerfully about the relative merits of various approaches to crossing a beaver-dammed section of creek that had cost Thibodeau his left boot for approximately 20 minutes. That was the last ordinary evening. On the morning of September 17th, the sky that had been clear and hard and cold showed a new colour at its western edge. When I came out of the tent at 6 to start the stove, a flat grey yellow that I recognised as a weather front coming off the coast range, the kind of front that in September moves faster than it appears to and drops more precipitation than the sky colour suggests. I told Hector when he came out, and he looked at it for a moment and said, "The valley crew should do their southern plots first and come back to the camp by noon." He went back into the cook tent, and I heard him talking to the others, and by 7 in the morning, the valley crew was on their way south toward the lower sample plots. And Hector and I had started up the ridge toward the remaining high elevation plots, with an agreement that everyone would be back at camp by noon. The front moved faster than either of us had calculated. By 9:30 the cloud was overhead and the temperature had dropped 8 degrees, and by 10 the rain was coming sideways off the ridge, and Hector and I had turned back, and we were at the camp by 11:15, and the valley crew was not there. They were not there at noon, and by 1 in the afternoon, the rain was coming down, hard enough to reduce visibility in the trees to perhaps 30 meters, and the creek to the south of the camp had risen enough that the log crossing we had used the day before was submerged, and Hector stood at the edge of the camp, looking south, and said nothing, and I stood next to him, and neither of us said what we were thinking. We had a signal mirror and a whistle and a flare, and we used all 3 over the course of that afternoon. Nobody answered. The rain was too heavy for the signal mirror to be useful. The whistle carried perhaps 100 meters in that kind of rain. We fired the flare at 4 in the afternoon, when the cloud was sitting on the ridge above us, and there was no one to see it. I do not know where the valley crew was on the afternoon of September 17th. I have thought about it for 34 years. I do not know. No one knows. What I know is what happened at the camp on the night of September 17th, which is the beginning of what I am trying to tell you. The rain stopped near midnight. I had been awake for most of it, sitting in the tent with a candle lantern and Hector's topographic map, tracing the valley crew's probable route and calculating, with the kind of focused usefulness that frightened men use to keep themselves from simply being frightened was asleep, or had achieved a state sufficiently close to sleep that his breathing had steadied and his hands, which had been tight on the tent pole for most of the evening, had relaxed. When the rain stopped, I heard the forest resume its particular silence, which is not silence at all but a layered assembly of sounds so familiar that they register as absence, the drip off the spruce boughs, the creek running at its new high level, the settling of the wet canvas, the small adjustments of animals in the undergrowth, returning to their normal nighttime routines after the disturbance of the storm. I heard all of that, and then, underneath all of that, I heard something else. It was a sound I have tried to describe to myself many times since, and have never found the right collection of words. For it was low, lower than the lowest note I could produce myself, and it was sustained, not pulsing, not rhythmic, not a call in any conventional sense, but more like a continuous tonal presence, the way a room hums when a piece of machinery in the wall is running, except that this was not mechanical. It was organic. It had the quality of breathing in it, of something large and alive, producing a sound that was partly intentional and partly simply the physical consequence of its existence. It lasted, I estimated, about 4 minutes. Then it stopped. Then, after perhaps 2 minutes of ordinary forest silence, it resumed for another 4 minutes. And then it stopped and did not resume. I do not know what that sound was. I know that Hector was awake for the second repetition of it, because when it stopped the second time he said, very quietly and without moving, that we should not go out of the tent until it was light. I said, I agreed. We did not say anything else. I do not believe either of us slept again before dawn. In the morning, which was grey and cold, with the creek running brown and high, and the sample, plot stakes we had set in the clearing to the south of the camp, knocked flat by the overnight water, there was a stack of firewood beside the cook tent that had not been there the night before. I want to be precise about this. When Hector and I had returned to camp the previous afternoon, there was a quarter cord of split wood under the fly at the back of the cook tent that we had brought in when we staged the camp, and it was diminished from its original quantity by 2 days of cooking and 1 evening of sitting around the camp stove against the cold. What was beside the cook tent on the morning of the 18th was a separate stack, neatly arranged, 47 pieces of split spruce, unsplit sections of fallen timber that someone had worked into stove lengths with something that was not an axe. The cuts were not the clean, smooth faces of a splitting maul, but something rougher and more compressive, as if the wood had been separated by sustained force applied without a blade. I estimated the weight of that stack at approximately 112 pounds. Hector walked around it twice without touching it. He crouched and looked at the cuts. He stood up and looked at the tree line to the north, where the dark timber ran unbroken up to the ridge. He said, in a voice that was careful and without emphasis, that he wanted me to record the stack in my field notebook. Weight estimate, piece count, description of the cut faces. I did that. He watched me do it. When I closed the notebook, he put his hand briefly on my shoulder, not in the way a man puts his hand on your shoulder when he is offering comfort, but in the way a man does it when he is establishing that you are real and present, and that what you have just documented together is real and present also. I have thought about that gesture for 34 years, the hand on the shoulder, and I believe it was Hector's way of saying that whatever was coming, we were going to look at it directly and record it accurately and not diminish it by pretending it was something other than what it was. We spent the 18th in the camp. There was no question of attempting to reach the valley crew through the swollen creek, and no question of climbing the ridge in the wet conditions. Hector made the decision to wait for the creek to drop and for the weather to stabilize. And in the meantime, we tended the camp, dried our gear, maintained the signal schedule, and said less to each other than we had said in all the previous days combined. The creek dropped through the day. The sky cleared toward evening. Hector cooked the last of the fresh meat for dinner and said we would start rationing the dried provisions beginning in the morning if the valley crew had not arrived, and he said this without the emphasis that would have made it frightening, the way a man states the next logical step in a practical problem, because that is what it was. The sound came again that night, beginning at approximately 10:30, the same low, sustained tone, the same duration, approximately 4 minutes, twice, with the same interval between. Hector and I both lay still in our sleeping bags and listened, and I noted in the dark the steadiness of my own breathing, which surprised me because I had expected to be afraid, and I was not afraid. I was something else, something for which I had no precise word at the time, and still do not have a fully adequate one. I was attentive in the way you are attentive when something large and important is happening nearby, and you have been given the privilege of being adjacent to it without being the subject of it. That is the closest I can come. On the morning of September 20th, I saw it. I want you to understand that I have not told anyone this. Not my wife, Denise, who died in 1998, and who was the person I trusted most in my life, and with whom I shared everything else I had. Not the inquiry officer, not my sons. I am telling you now because Hector is gone, and I am 74 years old. And the question of whether this account survives me has become, in the last 3 weeks, a question I cannot ignore. I woke before Hector. The sky was just beginning to show light in the east through the tent canvas, the particular grey-blue of the sky in the mountains at that hour, and I needed to walk to the edge of the camp to relieve myself. And I did so quietly, and when I turned back toward the camp, I saw it standing at the far edge of the clearing, near the tree line, approximately 40 meters from where I was standing. It was upright. That is the first and most important thing. Not in the posture of an animal that has risen briefly onto its hind legs, the posture that is effortful and unbalanced, the posture that communicates that a creature is doing something it was not built to do. This was the posture of a being for whom upright was the natural state, completely still, the weight distributed with the ease of long habit. I estimated its height at 8.5 feet. I estimated its weight at somewhere between 350 and 400 pounds, and those estimates come from 31 years of professional experience with the measurement of large standing things, and I am as confident in them as I am in any measurement I have made in my professional life. It was covered in fur, dark brown to charcoal, darker across the shoulders, with a slight variation toward a warmer brown along the arms, where the early light caught the hair at an angle. The face was visible to me at that distance in that light, and I will describe it as precisely as I am able. The brow was heavy and broad, projecting forward over the eyes, in a way that put the eyes themselves in shadow. But I could see the eyes, and they were dark, and they were directed at me, and they were calm. There was no expression that I can translate into the grammar of human faces. The face was not threatening, was not frightened, was not curious in the quick reactive way of an animal that has been startled. The face was, as near as I can describe it, simply present. It was the face of something that had been aware of me for longer than I had been aware of it, and had decided, for reasons I did not then understand, that this was the correct morning to let itself be seen. I stood still. I believe I stood still for approximately 2 minutes. I did not move toward it, and I did not move away from it, and I did not make any sound. I was aware of my own heartbeat, which was elevated but not racing. I was aware of the cold of the morning, the damp of the grass under my boots, the particular quality of the silence in the clearing, which was different from the ordinary silence of the mountain forests. In a way I cannot characterize beyond saying that it had more attention in it. Then Hector spoke from inside the tent, asking me if I wanted coffee, and the creature turned, without hurry, and in 3 or 4 steps that were nearly silent on the wet grass, was back among the trees and gone. I stood there for another full minute before I went back to the tent. I did not tell Hector what I had seen. Not that morning, not for 20 years. I do not know why I chose not to tell him immediately. I have asked myself this question many times. What I believed in the moment, standing there in the grey-blue light of that morning, was that what I had seen belonged in some way that I could not articulate to the category of things that lose something in the telling, that are diminished by being translated into the ordinary language of one person. Reporting an observation to another person over a cup of coffee in a tent. I believed that Hector already knew, in his bones, the general character of what was present in that forest, and that there was nothing useful I could add to that knowledge by making it explicit. I may have been wrong about this. I was 29 years old, and I was doing my best with a situation that had no provision in my training for it. On the morning of September 21st, on what would turn out to be the last morning we spent at that camp, the sound came not at night but in the late afternoon, in the long horizontal light of the early fall evening, and it came while Hector and I were both outside, in plain sight of the tree line, and on that afternoon it was accompanied by something I had not observed before, which was that the sound was not constant but varied, low in its fundamental tone, but modulated across the duration of each repetition, rising slightly and then falling and then rising again in a pattern that felt deliberate in the way music feels deliberate, not a mechanical repetition, but a shaped production. And when the second repetition ended, there was a pause of perhaps 30 seconds, and then the figure stepped out of the tree line. Not the same edge of the clearing I had seen it from the morning before, but the northern edge, the edge that pointed uphill toward the ridge, and it stood there in the evening light and looked at us, both of us, and Hector did not move, and I did not move, and I am not certain I was breathing in any conscious way. And after perhaps a minute, it raised one hand. It was the right hand. It raised slowly, not fully extended, Not the raised hand of a person hailing a friend across a distance, but partway, at an angle, held there for what I counted as approximately 8 seconds, and then lowered slowly back to its side. And then it turned and walked back into the trees in the same unhurried way I had observed the morning before, and the forest received it as the forest receives everything, which is to say without ceremony and without comment. Hector said, in a voice that was entirely level, that we would leave in the morning. I have thought about that raised hand for 34 years. I have thought about it in the way you think about a gesture that you understand was meant for you, but which was produced in a language you do not speak. And so you must work backward from the gesture itself, from its physical character and its timing, and the context in which it was offered, towards something that functions as meaning without ever quite arriving at the certainty of a translation. What I believe now is this. I believe the gesture was an acknowledgement. Not thanks, precisely, and not farewell, precisely, but an acknowledgement of the fact of our presence, of the 8 days we had occupied the same territory, of the fact that we had received what was offered, without reacting in ways that required a response. I believe it was the gesture of a being that had been watching us long enough to form a judgment about us, and that the judgment was, if not favourable, then at least not unfavourable, and that this was its way of making that judgment known before we left. I do not know this. I believe it. On the morning of September 22nd, Hector and I packed the camp and walked out. The creek had dropped to a passable level, and we crossed it at the original log crossing and followed the valley floor route south and west and reached the trailhead at approximately 3 in the afternoon. The search for the valley crew had already been organized by then. The logging road showed fresh tire tracks, and there were 2 ministry vehicles parked behind our own trucks, and the man in charge of the search came toward us when we emerged from the trees and asked us where the others were. And Hector said we did not know, that they had been on the valley floor route on the 17th and had not returned to camp before the storm closed the crossing, and that was true as far as it went. The search lasted 11 days. It covered approximately 60 square kilometers of the drainage above and below the survey camp. It found nothing, not equipment, not clothing, not any physical evidence of where Patrice Auger or Serge Villeneuve or André, Paquette or Clément Moreau or Yves Thibodeau had been after the morning of September 17th, when they walked south from the survey camp toward the lower sample plots. The official determination was that they were likely lost in the storm, that the flooding creek had possibly claimed one or more of them, and that the remote terrain and the elapsed time of the search made recovery unlikely. That determination was filed, and the file was closed, and the families of those 5 men received what the government could give them, which was not much, and the matter entered the category of unexplained disappearances in BC wilderness that the Provincial Records Office holds in a cabinet somewhere and does not revisit. I was interviewed twice by the inquiry officer, a man named Fredrickson, methodical and kind, and entirely without imagination, by which I mean he was incapable of asking a question that his prior understanding of the world did not equip him to ask. I told him the truth about the storm. I told him the truth about the creek crossing. I told him the truth about our signal attempts. He asked me if we had heard or seen anything unusual during our time at the camp, and I said we had heard some animal activity in the forest at night that we could not identify, which was true, and which was also not false, and which satisfied Fredrickson entirely, because it was the kind of answer his prior understanding of the world had prepared him to accept, and it closed the question before he could ask the next one, the one that would have required a different category of truth. Hector said nothing. He answered every question with the minimum necessary information. He was not evasive. He was simply exact, in the way that a surveyor is exact, giving no more and no less than the measurement called for. Fredrickson thanked him and shook his hand and wrote a report that contained nothing useful to anyone, and that report is presumably still in the cabinet with the file, and neither of us did anything to supplement it or correct it. And for 34 years, I have asked myself whether that was the right decision, and I have not arrived at a final answer. I need to tell you about Marguerite Deschênes, because her part of this account is the part that I could not have reported to Fredrickson, even if I had wanted to, because it happened months after the inquiry was closed, in the winter of 1969 into 1970. And Hector told me about it only once, in the spring of 1970. And I have never discussed it with anyone else until this morning. Hector and Marguerite lived on a small acreage outside of Golden, east of the river, with a woodlot behind the house that ran up into the lower timber. Marguerite was a practical woman, 66 years old when she died in 1987, who had spent 40 years in the kind of practical partnership that does not require much explaining, because each person already knows the whole of the situation, and the conversation is mostly about what needs doing next. Hector had come home from the Blaeberry drainage, different from how he had left. Not visibly, not in a way that required explanation, but different in the way that someone is different when they have understood something that cannot be communicated and have chosen to carry it quietly. Marguerite noticed this, as such a woman would notice, and she said nothing about it, as such a woman would say nothing, because she trusted that if there was something Hector needed to tell her, he would tell her, and if there was something he needed to carry alone, she would not require him to share it. In January of 1970, in the deep winter, Marguerite went out to the wood lot behind the house early on a Tuesday morning to bring in a supply of split wood for the week, and she found the wood pile arranged differently than she had left it. She had left it, as she always left it, in the practical stacked rows of a woman who has been managing firewood for 40 years. What she found was a different arrangement, an organization she did not recognize, logs of different sizes, sorted and placed in a pattern that she could not account for. And that was not the pattern of any wind or animal disturbance she had ever observed. And at the base of the arrangement, there were objects she had not placed there. 3 objects, a stone, smooth and dark, the size of a man's closed fist, a piece of bark from a spruce tree, peeled, clean and shaped by something she could not identify into a rough circle, approximately 20 centimeters across, and a small bundle of dried plants, tied with a stem of the same plant, which she identified as yarrow, common in the mountain meadows, unremarkable in itself, remarkable only in that it was there, and that it was placed with apparent intention, with the deliberateness of a thing placed rather than left. She brought the 3 objects inside. She showed them to Hector at breakfast, and described the arrangement, and described how she had found the woodpile. And Hector looked at the objects on the kitchen table, and was still for a long time. And then he said that someone had been watching over the place, And Marguerite asked him who, and he said he did not know exactly, and she looked at him in the way of a woman who understands that her husband knows more than he is saying and has decided that his reasons for not saying it are good reasons. And she said, very quietly, that she was grateful to whoever it was. She said this without irony. She said it in the way she would have said it if a neighbor had ploughed her, drive without being asked. She put the 3 objects on the shelf above the kitchen window, where they stayed for the remaining 17 years of her life. Hector told me this in the spring of 1970, when we were working together on a survey project near Revelstoke, and he told it to me in the same level tone he used for everything, with the same quality of precise reporting, as if he were giving me the measurements of a sample plot. And when he finished telling it, he looked at the mountain across the valley for a moment and said that he thought the sound we had heard in the camp, the sustained low tone, was not addressed to us. He thought it was addressed to whatever had been in the valley that week, addressed to the forest, and that the valley crew had heard it, or felt it, or been in the presence of it in some way that had led them away from us rather than toward us, and that this was not an accident and was not a danger. He said this carefully. He said he thought the valley crew had been moved, not harmed, and that moved was a word he was using because he did not have a better word, and that wherever they had been moved to, it was not a place he was able to find on any map he had ever worked with. He said he did not know this. He believed it. I do not know if Hector was right. I have thought about what he said for 34 years, and I have been unable to improve on it, and I have been unable to contradict it. And in the absence of any other account of what happened to those 5 men, the account that Hector carried for 34 years in silence is the only account I have. I want to say something about what the years between 1970 and this morning have been for me in relation to this, because the common understanding of a secret is that it is a burden, that carrying it diminishes you over time, that the weight of the untold thing presses down on every subsequent day until the telling is a relief and the silence was a kind of damage. I do not find that the common understanding applies here. What I found in the years of carrying this is that it changed the character of the world in a way that was not burdensome but enlarging. I went back into the BC forests for 31 years after 1969, and the forest I moved through was not the same forest I had moved through before, not because anything in it had changed, but because I understood that it contained things I could not map, that the boundary of what I knew how to measure was not the boundary of what was there, and that this was not a deficiency of my instruments or my methods, but simply the nature of a world that is larger than any account of it. This is not philosophy. This is what I observed. The forest was larger after 1969 than it had been before. Denise died in June of 1998, after a winter that was long and difficult, and that I will not describe at length, because she would not want me to describe it at length. What I will say is that she was a woman of the same order as Marguerite Deschênes, by which I mean she was a woman who trusted the evidence of her direct experience over any account of the world that contradicted it, and she had lived with me for 31 years and had understood, without my telling her, that I had come back from the Blaeberry drainage with something I was carrying that was not grief and was not damage, but was a kind of ongoing witness, and she had honoured that without requiring me to explain it, which was one of the many things I loved about her, and which I mention here because I want her name in this account. Her name was Denise Ariste Parento. She was my wife for 31 years, and she was the best surveyor of the interior of a situation that I have ever known. Hector called me in January of 2003 from Victoria to tell me that he was not going to be in the hospital for long. He was 81, and the condition was his heart. And the doctor had been honest with him, and he had received the doctor's honesty with the same quality of accurate patience he had brought to everything else in his life. We talked for almost 2 hours. He said he had been thinking, in the weeks since the diagnosis, about the question of whether the account should survive. And he had decided that it should, and that I was the right person to carry it forward, because I had been there and I was younger, and because, he said, I was the one who had seen it in the full morning light, which he had never done, and which gave me something to offer that he could not offer himself. He did not tell me to speak. He released me from the promise, which is different. The release was not an instruction. It was the opening of a door that had been closed for 34 years, and the decision about whether to walk through it was mine. I am walking through it now in my kitchen in March of 2003, with my grandson's recorder on the table and the grey-blue sky of a BC spring morning in the window. I want to say one more thing, and it is the most careful thing I have to say, and it is this. I do not know what happened to those 5 men. I do not know where they went, or what they saw, or what they were moved toward. I believe they were not harmed. I cannot verify this. I have no evidence for it. I have only what Hector told me in the spring of 1970, which was his belief, and which he held carefully and without revision for 34 years, and which Marguerite's objects on the kitchen shelf seemed to him to confirm, and which I have carried alongside my own observation of the clearing and the light and the face and the raised hand. And I have found, in 34 years of carrying it, that a belief held with enough precision and enough humility begins to function after a long time as a kind of knowledge, not the knowledge of a measurement, not the knowledge of a verified fact, the other kind, the kind that has no instrument for its verification except the life that has been lived around it, and the quality of the attention that life has brought to everything it has witnessed. The recorder is still running. There is a grey birch at the edge of my property that has been losing its leaves all morning, a few at a time, in no wind that I can feel from here, and I have been watching it between sentences, and I find that I have nothing else to say that would improve on the account I have just given, except this, that the world contains things that will not be surveyed, and that the man who understands this, who has looked at one of those things in the early morning light of a September day in the mountains and held his ground and breathed steadily, and taken it in without either reducing it or abandoning his capacity to observe it precisely, is a man who has been changed in a way that does not diminish and does not end. I am that man. Hector was that man. Marguerite put the stones on the shelf above the window and knew, without needing to be told, what the arrangement at the woodpile meant. And she was that woman, and there were 5 men in a valley in September of 1969 who became, in a way I cannot map, something else, and I do not know what they became. And I have stopped being frightened of not knowing. And I believe, at the end of this, that not knowing is the most honest account I can give. And that honest is the only thing left that matters.